By the time I saw the river again, the sky had already started to bruise. It was that in-between light, the kind that makes everything softer and meaner at the same time. The water ran high and brown beside the road, swollen from 3 days of rain, licking at the edges of the muddy bank like it was trying to claim just a little more town. I rolled the window down an inch. The air smelled like wet earth and old metal. Somewhere a dog barked once and then thought better of it. I hadn't been back in 10 years, but the road remembered my tires. Every turn came before I was ready, like muscle memory I didn't want. They'd told me they needed the house cleared out. That's what they called it. Clearing out, like we were talking about a shed or storage unit. Not the place where my mother died, and my brother made me promise to forget what I saw. The main street slipped by in pieces. The hardware store with the crooked open sign, the laundromat window fogged over from the inside, a boy on a bike riding with one hand, the other dragging along the rail of the bridge. Nobody looked up. I was just another car. At the end of the narrow road, past the last streetlight, the house came into view. Our house. The river house. It looked smaller than I remembered. Houses always do when you come back grown. The paint had given up trying a long time ago. It peeled in long, curling strips, exposing gray, tired wood underneath. The porch sagged in the middle like an old man's shoulders. One of the steps leaned to the left, trying hard not to collapse. But the curtains in the front room, those were the same. Sheer white, double-layered, hung in the careful folds my mother used to fuss over every Saturday morning. I sat there for a moment with the engine ticking as it cooled, staring at those curtains and thinking how stubborn fabric can be, how it can outlive the hands that shaped it. I killed the engine and the silence pressed in. Just the river, moving heavy and unseen behind the houses. The key they'd mailed me was colder than it should have been. It stuck in the lock for a second before it turned, like the door was thinking it over. When it swung open, the first thing that hit me was the smell. Lemon cleaner over dust. Sharp and sweet and stale all at once. Like someone had come in a hurry, wiped every surface they could see, and left without opening a single window. I stepped over the threshold. The floor creaked like it remembered me, a long, drawn-out sound that traveled under my feet and into my chest. Inside, everything was almost the same. Almost. The old beige couch sat under the front window. The same indentation on the left cushion where my father used to fall asleep watching the news. The coffee table still had the pale ring from a glass of iced tea my mother scolded him about for weeks. The TV was flatter than I remembered. That was new. But the stand beneath it still bore the faint scratch from where Mark and I had played sword fight with curtain rods. I let my fingertips skim the back of a chair. The fabric was rougher now, threadbare in places. Little dust ghosts lifted where I touched, turning golden in the thin light. Every object I passed dropped a small weight into me. The clock on the wall ticked too loud. My suitcase wheels thunked against the doorway as I pulled it in and let it go, right there in the entryway. I didn't even try to be tidy. There was a kind of relief in that. "Still you," I murmured. My voice sounded wrong in the room. Thin, not as sure as the ticking. I walked through slowly, like the house might spook if I moved too fast. The kitchen tiles were colder. I could feel it through the soles of my shoes. The same square table with one leg slightly shorter. The folded napkins in a basket my mother insisted made the place look put together. There was a bottle of cleaner on the counter, the cheap store brand, and a half-used roll of paper towels. Mark's doing, I figured. He'd been coming by, taking care of things, at least enough so the pipes didn't freeze and the mice remembered to stay outside. I opened one cupboard and stopped. The top shelf still held the chipped blue mug my mother favored. Handle cracked, gold rim mostly rubbed away. Someone had turned it so the crack faced the back, hiding the flaw. I didn't touch that one. Instead, I ran my hand along the edge of the counter. The laminate had begun to bubble at one corner. If I pushed, I knew it would peel right up. I kept my hand flat. The refrigerator hummed in the background. Somewhere, deep in the house, a pipe clicked once as it cooled. The sounds layered over each other, small and domestic, and underneath them all was something else, waiting. I moved back toward the hallway, past the family photos that still lined the wall. School portraits, Christmas snapshots. My parents on their wedding day, black and white, faces so open it almost hurt to look at. Halfway down the hall, I stopped. At the far end, above where the light didn't quite reach, was the square outline of the attic hatch. A plain wooden frame, a little brass latch. Harmless, if you didn't know better. My throat tightened, small and sudden. I hadn't thought about that door on the ceiling in years. Not on purpose, anyway. But standing there, smelling lemon and dust, I could feel the weight of it above me, like someone had parked a car in the rafters. I looked away first. The sound of a truck engine floated in from outside, low and familiar. Gravel crunched, tires rolling into the space beside my car. Headlights flashed briefly across the living room wall, then went dark. I stayed in the hallway for one more breath before I turned back toward the front door. Mark took a minute to get out. I watched through the thin curtain as he sat behind the wheel, hands resting on his steering, staring straight ahead. Then he moved slowly, like getting out of that truck cost him. When he stepped onto the porch, I saw it. He was bigger. Not just heavier, though he was that too. His shoulders had filled out, his stomach a little soft under the worn denim jacket, but something in his face had grown solid, like concrete that had set wrong and hardened that way. He opened the door without knocking. "Hey," he said. His voice caught me off guard more than his face. Deeper, rougher, but still with that same flatness, like he was keeping everything important 2 rooms back. "Hey," I answered. For a second we just stood there, framed by the doorway, his boots on the mat, my feet on the worn runner. 10 years of not sharing air pressed between us. He dropped his keys in the bowl by the door. The metal clinked against the ceramic, too loud. "You find it okay?" he asked. "It hasn't moved. Kinda hard to miss." That got the barest twitch at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile, just the idea of one. He stepped closer, arms opening a little. The hug was adequate. His jacket smelled like rain and cigarette smoke and that faint hint of motor oil he never could wash out. His arms went around me, careful, as if I might bruise easily now. I pressed my cheek briefly against his shoulder and then we both let go at the same time. He didn't quite meet my eyes. His gaze slid just past them, landing somewhere around my forehead. "You look older." That happens. And we both let the joke fall to the floor between us. He glanced around the room, taking in what I'd already seen. The cleaner on the counter, the suitcase by the door. "Dad's nurse said you got in this morning." I drove straight through. Wanted to get a feel for it again. "Yeah." The silence that followed felt like the house had stepped into the conversation too. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Power's fine, heat works. I came by last week. Just, don't use the back burner on the stove. It clicks, but it won't light." I nodded. Little facts, safe facts. For a while we walked through the rooms together, him a step ahead, turning on lights, flicking switches, opening and closing cabinet doors as if proving the house still functioned. I followed, my gaze catching on old stains in the carpet, dents in the walls, the shadowed places where furniture used to sit. We didn't talk about why he'd stayed all these years. We didn't talk about why I hadn't. Back in the hallway, he paused to straighten one of the family photos that had tilted over time. His fingers lingered on the frame of our mother's face, then dropped. My eyes went past him, pulled to the top of the hallway like a magnet, to the attic hatch. It sat there, blank and quiet, no different than any other square of wood in any other ceiling, but I felt my stomach give a small, hard twist, like it was trying to turn away inside me. Mark followed my gaze. For a beat, something moved behind his eyes, a flicker, there and gone. "We'll start downstairs," he said, quickly, like he was talking about choosing where to put the boxes. But there was a tightness at the edge of his mouth, a subtle stiffening of his shoulders. "Sure," I agreed. "Downstairs." We turned away together, back toward the living room light. Our footsteps made hollow sounds on the wood, echoing up and then getting swallowed somewhere above. Even with my back to it, I could feel that square in the ceiling, sitting over us like a held breath. And as I picked up the first cardboard box and stood it on the coffee table, a thought slid in, small and unwelcome. How long could we work under that hatch? Pretend to live under it again, without whatever was nailed shut up there finally giving way? The morning light in that house was always softer than it had any right to be. It came in slow through the thin curtains, pale and patient, turning the gust in the air into drifting threads of gold. When I opened my eyes, I could see them above me, floating in the stripe of light that cut across my old bedroom ceiling. For a moment, I forgot where I was. The bed felt smaller, the sheets stiffer, the air heavier. Then the smell found me. Lemon cleaner, worn wood, a hint of something old underneath that no one could scrub away. The river house. Home, in the way a scar is part of your skin. Somewhere below me, a floorboard creaked. Then another, closer to the kitchen. Water ran for a few seconds, then stopped. The low clink of a mug on a countertop. Mark was already up. I lay there a little longer, listening to the house wake around him. The heater clicking on, a cabinet opening and closing, the refrigerator humming its old steady drone. It was like the building was taking inventory of who was inside it again. I swung my legs out of bed and set my feet down on the cold wood. It creaked under my weight like it remembered the pattern. Same spot, same sound. In the kitchen, the light was different. Brighter, slanting in over the sink and across the table, catching the steam rising from two mismatched mugs. Mark stood at the counter in a faded t-shirt and jeans, hair still damp from a quick shower. He didn't look up right away, just reached for the coffee pot and tipped it toward the empty mug waiting at the edge of the table. "Morning," he said. His voice sounded like gravel rolled around in a hand. "Morning," I answered, pulling out a chair. The wood made a soft, scraping noise on the floor, familiar as breathing. He slid the mug toward me without meeting my eyes. The coffee was too strong, a little bitter. It was exactly how my father used to make it. My mother's way was different. More water, a pinch of sugar, a dash of cinnamon when she remembered. We didn't talk about that. Instead, we talked about boxes. "We'll start in the living room," he said. "Easiest to get out the front door. Then we'll see what we've got energy for." I nodded, wrapping my hands around the warm ceramic like it was the only solid thing in the room. "Sure," I said. "Living room." By the time we carried the broken-down cardboard boxes in from his truck, the pale light had spread itself across the front room. It slipped around the edges of the curtains and fell in long, soft rectangles on the carpet. Dust floated through it, slow and unbothered, as if we weren't about to rearrange its whole world. We set the boxes down by the coffee table. The room looked the way a held breath feels. "All right," Mark said, clapping his palms together once, more habit than enthusiasm. "Blankets, tapes, books. 3 piles. Keep, donate, trash." He said the words like they were nothing, just categories, just decisions. I nodded again and knelt by the old wooden chest under the window. It stuck a little before it opened, the hinges complaining in a low, rusty whine. On top were the blankets. My mother had folded them last, I was sure of it. The top one was the faded yellow one she used to pull over us when we'd fall asleep on the couch. The fabric had gone thin at the edges, satin trim fraying. I lifted it, inhaling without meaning to. It smelled like dust and something faintly sweet, like the ghost of laundry detergent. "This one?" I held it up. Mark didn't even glance. "Done it," he said. The word landed harder than it should have. My hands paused. "It's still good," I managed. "We could keep a couple for—" "You live in an apartment," he cut in, reaching for a stack of VHS tapes on the shelf. "I live in a house half this size. We don't need 6 extra blankets." I folded it carefully anyway, laying it on top of the donate box. The label we'd written in his blocky handwriting looked too dark on the cardboard. We worked in silence for a while. I folded, he stacked. The rustle of fabric and the soft clack of plastic cases filled the spaces where conversation should have gone. I picked up an old tape, the black plastic warm from the patch of sunlight it had been sitting in. The handwritten label on the spine read, "Lena, 3rd grade concert." A small, uneven heart sat beside my name. My thumb traced it once. Without looking at me, Mark reached out and took it. His fingers brushed mine rough and quick. "We don't even have a VCR," he said, almost too fast. He started a new pile on the far end of the coffee table. "I'll figure out somewhere to send these." I watched the way his hand hovered just a second too long before he set the tape down, like the plastic was hotter than it should have been. "Okay," I said softly. I didn't ask who he meant by we. At the bottom of the chest, under a layer of dust that left lines on my fingertips, I found a stack of old school projects. Construction paper faded around the edges, staples rusting. I pulled one out, a 4th grade report on frogs, my name written in careful, uneven letters across the top. The smell of old paper lifted up, dry and familiar. I remembered being up late at this table, glue on my hands, my mother leaning over my shoulder, smoothing my hair back from my face with ink-stained fingers. "You always pick the messiest animals," she'd teased. "Next time choose something with less slime." In the living room now, no one laughed. I held the paper out toward Mark. "Do you want any of these?" He glanced over, saw my childish handwriting, and something like a flinch passed through his expression. It was quick, but it was there. "You should take them," he said. "Don't you want them?" "They'll just sit in a box," he answered too quickly. His gaze had already moved past the page, back to the blank labels of the tapes. "Better they sit in your closet than mine." As the morning stretched into afternoon, I began to notice a pattern. Any time I turned up something with her handwriting on it,
Labels, margins of old cookbooks, notes scribbled on the backs of envelopes. Mark's hands moved a little faster. He'd reach out, grab the item between two fingers like it might leave a mark, and toss it into a closed box or flip it upside down so the ink faced the table. I tested it once without thinking, handing him a recipe card for her Sunday stew. The card had a faint grease stain in one corner, her curly letters looping off the edge where she'd run out of space. His fingers brushed mine and then jerked back, almost dropping it. "Trash," he said automatically. Then he paused. His jaw worked once. "Or just put it with the rest of the paperwork. For later." "For later," I repeated, sliding it into a different box. We didn't say what later meant, or who it was for. We talked about everything else instead. "The realtor's schedule," he said, taping a box shut with long, even pulls. "Wants to take pictures while there's still furniture. Says it helps buyers imagine themselves here."
Assisted living bills. They're raising the rate next quarter, he muttered, flipping through a stack of envelopes on the dining table. Says it's cost of care, but they don't do anything different. Repairs. Roof's got a soft spot over the kitchen, he added, writing a note on a legal pad without lifting his eyes. Might scare buyers off, or maybe they won't look up. He spoke like a man ticking boxes on a list that never ended. The only thing we didn't talk about was why our father needed that facility, or how long we'd known he should have been somewhere like that, or the woman whose handwriting kept surfacing under our hands like a body that refused to stay down. By late afternoon, the light in the living room had changed. It thinned out, turned gray around the edges, leaving the corners of the room in a soft kind of shadow. The boxes we'd filled lined one wall, labels tilted and curling. The coffee table was mostly clear now, just a few stray papers, and the chipped mug sitting by itself, catching the last strip of pale sun. My back ached from bending. There was dust under my nails, a faint paper cut stinging at the side of my thumb. Mark sat on the edge of the couch, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor like it had something written there only he could see. For the first time all day, the house was truly quiet around us. No tape ripping, no clink of dishes. Just the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, and far away, the softened rush of the river. Then, from somewhere above us, came a sound. A faint creak. Not loud, just enough to nudge the silence. It traveled down through the ceiling, into the walls, and settled in my bones. I looked up automatically. The ceiling over the living room was smooth and yellowed with age, nothing to see but an old water stain in one corner. But I knew where that sound had come from. Not the roof, lower, the space between. Mark didn't look up. He stayed bent forward, hands clasped, knuckles white. "House is still settling," he said, like he'd been waiting to use that sentence. "Old wood. You know how it is." His tone was flat, almost bored, but the tendons in his neck stood out a little too sharp. The sound didn't come again. The ceiling answered our listening with its own kind of silence, the heavy kind that follows after someone lies, and both of you know it. I kept my gaze on that blank stretch of plaster a few seconds longer, tracing the outline of where the attic floor would be. If these rooms could remember so much, coffee rings and half-finished projects, and the feel of my mother's hands in my hair, what was pressed into the boards above them, in the place we still refused to name? I lowered my eyes back to the half-empty room, to the chipped mug and the boxes, and my brother's bent shoulders, and felt that same small twist in my throat. We had only cleared one room, and already the house was talking. I couldn't help wondering what would happen when we finally went upstairs and asked it to speak plainly. I was standing in the hallway, looking up at the attic hatch, when the night came back to me. It didn't come in order, not the way you'd tell it to a stranger. It arrived in flashes of sound and light. The shape of my mother's shadow on the kitchen wall, the slam of the back door, the smear of rain on the window. The bulb over my head hummed softly, warming the yellowed ceiling, and for a moment it felt like I was 16 again, barefoot on the same floor, the house holding its breath around me. Back then, the night had started quiet. I remember that part clearly, maybe because quiet never lasted long in our house. The sky had gone black too early, heavy clouds pressing low over the river. You could smell the storm before it came in, that damp mineral scent slipping through the gaps in the windows. We'd eaten dinner without tasting it, forks against plates, the muted clink of ice in my father's glass, my mother's eyes on the clock more than the food. Mark had barely said a word, shoulders bunched, chewing too fast. I'd retreated upstairs when the dishes started, like I always did.
Homework spread out on my bed, a pencil between my teeth, the muffled sound of the TV in the living room, where my father liked to pretend he wasn't listening to anything else. The first raindrops tapped against the glass, slow and scattered, like someone thinking. I remember that I was trying to read the same sentence for the third time when her voice broke the surface of the house. It wasn't loud at first, just tighter than usual. "We can't keep doing this, Daniel." The words rose up through the vents and cracks in the floor, through the banister posts, found me where I was pretending not to listen. I slid off the bed and moved to my bedroom door, opening it an inch. The hallway was dark except for the thin line of light spilling up from downstairs. I heard his answer, low and sharp, words I couldn't make out, only the rhythm of them. Dismiss, deny, dismiss. I crept down a few steps, stopping where the carpet started, the wood under it groaning softly under my weight. From there I could see a sliver of the kitchen, my mother's back, her hand on the counter, gripping the edge hard enough that her knuckles went pale. "I'm not raising the kids in this house another year," she said. Her voice cracked on "another," and she cleared her throat quickly like she could smooth it out. "You keep promising it's going to get better, but the bills keep piling up and your temper—" She cut herself off. The word temper landed between them anyway. My father's shadow shifted on the wall. I heard the clink of glass, harder this time, as he set it down. "Where are you going to go?" he asked. He had that quiet tone he used when he was trying not to yell because the neighbors might hear. It was worse than yelling. "You got money I don't know about? You got some plan, Isabel?" He said her name like it embarrassed him. There was a pause then, the kind where you know a choice is being made. When my mother turned away from the counter, I saw she was holding an envelope. Thick, swollen with something more than a letter. Cash, I know now. Back then, it just looked important. She stepped out of my limited view, and for a second I thought she was heading for the door. Instead, her footsteps came toward the bottom of the stairs. "Mark," she called, and my brother appeared from the living room, lanky and serious, 17 and already trying to be older than our father. He wiped his hands on his jeans, like he'd been expecting this. The house felt very small in that moment, like all the walls had leaned in to listen. From my halfway spot on the stairs, I watched her press the envelope into his hand, fingers closing around his like she could fuse it there. "You choose who you are with, not him," she whispered. Her face was turned up to his, eyes bright and tired. "You hear me? Not him." Her thumb brushed over the back of his hand in a slow circle, the way she used to soothe us when we were little. Mark looked over her shoulder, toward the back door where my father had just gone out to smoke, or to breathe, or to think about not thinking. His jaw was tight. "Nom," he started, but she shook her head like they'd already had this part of the conversation dozens of times, and there was no room left for more words. "Just hold on to it until I say." And then she let go and moved back toward the kitchen, toward the sink, toward whatever came next. I retreated to my room after that, heart beating in a way that felt too big for my ribs. The rain had started in earnest now, streaking down the window in silver lines, catching the blow from the street lamp out front. I tried to go back to my homework, but the words on the page had turned into black worms, wriggling out of meaning. Somewhere below, the TV flicked back on. Laughter from an audience drifted up faintly. Normal if you didn't listen closely. It was later, hours or minutes, it's hard to tell now, when I went to the window and saw them outside. The porch light threw a dull yellow circle onto the wet driveway, the rain making it shimmer like cheap gold. Mark stood just at the edge of that light, jacket pulled on, shoulders hunched against the cold. My father was closer to the house, half in shadow, cigarette ember glowing near his face. Their heads were bent toward each other. I pressed my forehead to the cool glass, breath fogging a small circle. The envelope was in Mark's hand. Even from upstairs, I could tell by the way he held it, reluctant, fingers tight like it might bite. My father said something I couldn't hear, and held out his palm. The porch light hummed, flickering once. Mark hesitated, then extended his arm and placed the envelope into that waiting hand. It was a small motion, a transfer of weight from one set of fingers to another. If you'd looked away at that exact second, you would have missed it. But I didn't look away. I watched my father's thumb smooth over the edge of the envelope, the way my mother's had smoothed over Mark's skin. He nodded once, short, satisfied, and clapped his son's shoulder like they'd just finished a team sport.
The shouting started not long after they came back inside. This time, there was no pretending not to hear. My mother's voice, sharp and scared, asking, "Where is it? Daniel, what did you do?" My father's louder, crashing over hers, a storm of words about his house and his money and running away. A glass broke, a sharp, shattering sound that made me flinch even upstairs. Something heavy hit the wall. A door slammed so hard the frame in my room rattled. Then, cutting through it all, the sudden roar of an engine in the driveway. I ran back to the window in time to see her car backing out too fast, tires skidding on the wet gravel. Headlights cut across the neighbor's yard, then swung toward the road. She didn't look back at the house, or if she did, the rain and the glass and the distance made it impossible for me to see. The taillights disappeared down the street, swallowed by the dark and the downpour. The sound of the engine faded, then was gone, leaving only the hiss of rain and the echo of unsaid things in its place. Morning came like it always does, indifferent. The light was gray, thin, trying to push its way through clouds and curtains. I remember the knock on the door, the way it sounded different from a neighbor's knock. Too firm, formal. Mark opened it and 2 officers stood on the porch, hats damp, faces composed into that neutral arrangement people wear when they are about to dismantle your life as gently as they can. They said words like accident and conditions and lost control of the vehicle. My father stood behind them, one hand braced on the doorframe, his knuckles white. I watched from the stairs again, fingers curled around the banister. Every time they said, "Your mother," my chest tightened, like the words were too big to fit in there now. Mark didn't ask any questions. He stared past their shoulders, at the wet driveway where her car had last been, eyes red but dry. When the officers finally left, their boots squelching softly on the doormat, the house fell into a kind of silence I'd never heard before, not just quiet, hollow. It was in that hollow that Mark came to find me. He didn't call my name. He just appeared at the base of the stairs, face gray, eyes darker than I'd ever seen them. "Come here," he said, voice low and rough. I followed him up, past the family photos, past my bedroom door, to the small set of steps that led to the attic hatch. He stopped there and turned to face me. We were nearly the same height by then, but he seemed smaller somehow, like someone had taken the air out of him. "What you saw last night," he began, then stopped. His throat worked. He looked past me for a second, up at the square in the ceiling. "You don't tell anyone. Ever. You understand?" I opened my mouth, but no sound came out. He leaned closer, his hand gripping the railing beside my head. "Say it," he whispered. "Promise me, Lena, you don't tell them about the envelope, about me. You don't repeat what I said. You keep it between us." His eyes were wet now, but the tears didn't fall. "I betrayed her," he choked out, the words tearing their way up. "This is on me." Hearing him say it out loud was like stepping onto a floor I hadn't realized was rotten. Everything in me wanted to say no, to pull away, to throw his confession back at his feet. Instead, I heard myself whisper, "I promise," because I didn't know what else to do with his breaking face. He nodded once, as if a deal had been struck, and stepped back down the stairs. I stayed there, midway between the house and the attic, between what had happened and what we would tell ourselves about it, feeling that promise settle on my shoulders like another layer of dust. Years later, standing under that same hatch, I would still be asking myself the same question. What kind of brother binds you to his worst moment and calls it love? By mid-morning, the house had settled into that gray kind of light that makes everything look a little softer and a little more tired. I stood in the hallway with a roll of packing tape in my hand, staring up at the square of wood in the ceiling. The attic hatch sat there, plain and quiet, edges shadowed, like it was pretending to be just another piece of the house. Behind me, I heard Mark's boots on the floor, the small jangle of his keys in his pocket, and for a second I almost didn't say anything. "Maybe we start up there," I said, finally. My voice sounded careful even to me. "Get the worst of it over with?" He didn't answer right away. I could feel him behind me, the warmth of another person in the narrow hall, his breathing a little heavier from hauling empty boxes in from the truck. When he did speak, it was the kind of shrug you hear more than see. "Nothing up there but junk and bad insulation," he said. "No need to go up there." It was the words, more than the tone, that landed. They dropped straight down through me, heavy and familiar. I'd heard that exact sentence before, in a deeper voice that smelled like whiskey and Old Spice. My father at the base of the same hall, one hand on my shoulder, the other waving away my questions. No need to go up there. Like curiosity was something dangerous that could burn the house down.
I kept my eyes on the ceiling. "We'll have to clear it eventually," I said, but there wasn't much fight in it. "Yeah, eventually." He moved past me, shoulder brushing mine. "Realtor wants photos of the bedrooms. We should start where it shows." The hall felt narrower after he walked away. I let the tape roll slip from one hand to the other and followed him, the hatch staying above me like a held breath. We started with the closets. There was something almost clinical about it at first. Take everything out, make piles, fold, stack, decide. The hallway closet by the front door gave up coats and scarves and shoes that still had a faint memory of snow on them. I pulled out my mother's old red raincoat, the one with the missing button. The plastic felt stiff under my fingers, but when I pressed my face closer, I could still catch the ghost of her perfume under the dust. That same warm, powdery scent she'd leave on our pillows when she kissed us goodnight. "Donate?" Mark said from behind me, not looking up from the box he was labeling. I hesitated. "It's in good shape. You live in a place that gets, 2 inches of rain a year? Let it go to someone who will use it." I folded it slowly and set it on top of the donation pile, smoothing the sleeves out like I was tucking someone in. In my parents' bedroom, the air felt heavier, like the room had been holding itself still for years and didn't quite know how to start again. The curtains were half drawn, letting in a weak spill of afternoon light that fell right across the closet doors. When I slid them open, the faint scent of my mother's perfume floated out, thin but stubborn. A row of her dresses still hung there, shoulders covered in flimsy plastic from the dry cleaner, dates stamped in the corner from a decade ago. I ran my hand along them, the fabrics whispering under my fingers. Cotton, silk, something rougher. I found the navy dress she'd worn to my 8th grade graduation, the one that made her look taller than she was. For a second, I wasn't 32 in a musty bedroom. I was 13 again, watching her smooth that dress over her hips, asking if it was too much for a middle school gym. "Take what you want," Mark said from the doorway. He stayed back, hands in his pockets, eyes on the carpet. "The rest goes to Goodwill or the church." "You sure?" I glanced over my shoulder at him. "Some of this is nice." He shrugged. "She's not coming back for it." There wasn't anything cruel in the way he said it, just flat, like he was reporting the weather. Still, I saw his jaw move when I lifted one of the hangers down, like he was chewing on something that wouldn't quite break apart. We carried armfuls of framed photos to the dining table, laying them out in crooked rows. The glass surfaces caught the light, throwing small, bright rectangles onto the ceiling. Us as kids in Halloween costumes, teeth missing. My parents at some cousin's wedding, my mother mid-laugh, my father already turning away. School portraits with forced smiles and bad haircuts. Mark picked up frames and put them down quickly, I skating over anything where our mother was in the center. "This one's good." He set aside a picture of just the two of us on the front steps, chocolate ice cream smeared across my chin. "Maybe Dad can have a couple in his room. Something familiar." He didn't mention having any in his own house. I didn't ask. Every hour or so, he'd disappear into the kitchen. I'd hear the soft hiss of a bottle cap twisting off, the small clink as it hit the counter. He wasn't drunk, not by a long stretch. If anything, each beer seemed to pull him further inward, stripping away what little small talk he'd managed that morning. His answers shortened. "Yeah, no, whatever you think." When I mentioned a memory, Mom playing cards at this table, Mom burning the first Thanksgiving, his shoulders tightened almost imperceptibly, and his hands found some task that didn't require looking at me. Folding newspaper around a frame, tearing packing tape in 2 long strips, checking his phone when it hadn't buzzed. By early evening, the light in the dining room had thinned out to almost nothing. The boxes we'd filled formed a low cardboard wall along one side of the room, marker scrawls bleeding into one another.
Keep. Donate. Dad. The word mom wasn't on any of them. Mark's phone finally did ring while I was bubble wrapping a delicate glass dish I didn't recognize. The sound cut sharp through the quiet. He glanced at the screen and muttered, "I need to take this," like I might argue. He stepped out onto the front porch, the screen door clicking shut behind him, his voice dropping low and muffled as he answered. The house, without him moving around in it, felt suddenly larger and hollower. I set the dish down carefully, wiped my dusty hands on my jeans, and walked back toward the hallway almost before I knew I was going. Each step sounded louder, the boards complaining under my feet. The overhead light in the hall had been left off, so the space was lit only by the spill of day's last light from the front room, a soft, tired glow that didn't quite reach the end. I stopped under the attic hatch. Up close, the wood frame looked more worn than I had noticed. Tiny cracks in the paint, a faint dark smudge where, over the years, hands had reached up to pull it down. I raised my arm and traced the outline of the frame with my fingertips, feeling the uneven texture of old brush strokes. The metal latch was cool when I touched it. Familiar. It had always been there, that small crescent of dull steel. I remembered my father's hand closing over mine once when I was little, pulling it away. "No need to go up there," he'd said, jaw tight. "That's not for you." Like the space above our heads held something I couldn't survive knowing. Now, as my fingers moved lower along the latch, they bumped against something new. It was small, solid, an extra weight added where there hadn't been one before. I stepped back just enough to let the dim light catch it. A padlock. Shiny, unscarred, the brass still bright, numbers etched clean into the side, bolted straight through the old metal latch like a fist clenching shut. It looked wrong against the tired wood and flaking paint. Too new, too deliberate. 16 years ago, that lock hadn't been there. I knew that the way you know the shape of your own hand. I reached up and brushed it with my knuckles. It swung slightly, a dull, muted clink against the latch. Locked. Firm. Outside, through the thin walls, I could just make out the murmur of Mark's voice on the phone. A pause, a low, "Yeah, I'll handle it," and then silence again. He told me there was nothing up here but junk and bad insulation. He said it with the same lazy conviction our father had once used to keep us out. But our father had never needed a lock. I stood there in the half-dark, my fingers resting lightly on the cold curve of the padlock, and felt it like a question between us. If it was only dust and old holiday decorations up there, why go to the trouble of locking it like a crime scene? Why add metal and key and secrecy to a space already forgotten by everyone but the house? The ceiling didn't answer. It just loomed quietly over the rooms we'd already disturbed, the ones we still had left to touch. Somewhere beneath my feet, the refrigerator kicked on. The river moved past the back of the house, unseen and steady. I let my hand fall back to my side and stepped away from the hatch, but the weight of that little golden lock followed me, sitting just behind my ribs. Whatever Mark had tried to seal above our heads, it wasn't going to stay quiet forever. The sky changed before anything else did. By mid-morning, it had sunk low over the river, a heavy gray lid pressing down on the town, the kind of sky that flattens sound and makes the street feel shorter than it is. From the kitchen window, I could see the bare branches in the yard barely moving, like even the wind didn't feel like trying. Inside, the house had slipped into that dull, in-between light where nothing has sharp edges. The refrigerator hummed in the corner, steady and patient, like it knew how long the day was going to be. Mark was already by the door, keys in hand. He had that restless way about him, the one he got when the walls started closing in. "I've got some errands," he said, not quite looking at me. "Pharmacy, bank. I'll be back in a few hours." He didn't offer more than that, and I didn't push. We both knew errands could mean anything from paying bills to driving aimlessly around the outskirts of town with the radio too loud. He lingered a second, fingers tapping against the keyring. Then, "Don't do anything crazy while I'm gone." The attempt at a joke barely landed. I gave him a small smile anyway. "I'll try not to move the house off its foundation." He nodded, pulled the door open. The thick light from outside spilled in around him, turning him into a silhouette for a heartbeat. Then the door closed, and the house swallowed the sound of his truck starting, the engine fading down the road until all that was left was the hum of the fridge and the faint tick of the wall clock. For the first time since I'd arrived, I was alone here. I stood in the middle of the kitchen, hands idle, and listened. The house had its own version of breathing, small clicks as it settled, a faint whistle around one of the old window frames, the muffled rush of the river beyond the back lot. Overhead, somewhere beyond plaster and beams, the attic sat like a held thought, locked, waiting. I should have started another closet, one of the bedrooms, something safe. Instead, my eyes drifted to the door at the back of the kitchen, the basement door, closed, paint-worn smooth where hands had pushed it 1,000 times. If the worst things in this house were above us, then the oldest were below. The door groaned softly when I opened it. A cool breath rose up from the dark, smelling of concrete, old wood, and something damp that lived in the cracks. I felt for the switch on the wall,
The bulb at the bottom of the stairs flickered to life, weak and yellow, throwing more shadow than light. The stairs were unfinished wood, narrow and slightly uneven. I put my hand on the rail, just a rough 2x4 nailed to the wall, and started down. Each step answered me with a hollow creak, different from the sound upstairs. Down here, the noise seemed to echo off the concrete, coming back a half-second later like a second pair of footsteps trailing mine. At the bottom, the air settled around me, cooler by a few degrees. The basement was wider than I remembered, the ceiling low enough that the hanging bulb felt close to my head. The concrete floor was stained in places with old spills and dark patches where time had seeped in. Against the far walls, shapes loomed, shelving that had bowed under the weight of too many years, boxes slumped in on themselves, rusted tools nailed to pegboard in careful rows. My father's handwriting was everywhere down here. Thick black marker on duct tape boxes, Xmas lights. Taxes, 1998 to 2002. Daniel, tools. There was a comfort and a small discomfort in how orderly it all was. Even his chaos had labels. I moved slowly between the shelves, fingertips trailing along the edges of boxes, the ridges of old paint cans. A spider web brushed the back of my hand, its thread surprisingly strong. I brushed it away, murmuring a quiet sorry out of habit. Toward the back, under a wooden workbench scarred with saw marks and grease, a box sat slightly apart from the others. Not stacked, not buried, just there. Its cardboard was warped at the bottom from some long-ago flood or spill, corners sagging, but the top was taped with an almost fussy precision. Across the lid were 2 words, in my father's neat block letters. Isabel, keep. My mouth dried out. There was something jarring about seeing her name in his handwriting, like 2 notes that didn't quite make a chord. I dragged the box out into the open, the cardboard scraping softly against the concrete. Little flakes of dried tape fell onto the floor. When I pulled at the edge, the tape peeled up with a brittle sound, curling back on itself. The smell that came out when I lifted the lid was a mix of old paper, fabric that hadn't seen sunlight in years, and the faintest ghost of her perfume, caught and preserved by accident. On top was a scarf I remembered. Thin wool, once a deep green, now faded around the edges. She used to wrap it twice around her neck in winter, cheeks going pink above it as she scraped ice off the windshield. I brought it to my face and inhaled. Mostly dust now, but under that, something warm and intangible that made my eyes sting. I folded it with more care than it probably needed and laid it beside me on the floor. Beneath the scarf were stacks of paper held together with brittle rubber bands that snapped when I touched them. I spread the pages out in my lap, the concrete cold under my legs even through my jeans. The first sheet was a letter, though it never been mailed. Dear Mary, it began in my mother's looping script. Mary, her younger sister. They hadn't spoken much, not after Mary moved west. I read the opening lines. The date in the corner placed it 2 years into my parents' marriage, before we were born, before the river house. She wrote about the move to town, about the way the river sounded at night, louder than she had expected, about the smallness of the kitchen and the way Daniel left his boots in the doorway, trailing mud she couldn't quite bring herself to scold him for. It was light, almost playful. Then, in the second paragraph, the ink darkened where the pen had pressed harder. She wrote, Sometimes he gets so mad about money. Not at me, he says, at the world, at the bills, at his father. But the walls don't know the difference. The kids we might have someday won't either. I keep thinking I should squirrel away enough for a new start, just in case. Is that terrible? I read that line 3 times. Squirrel away enough for a new start. The words felt dangerously familiar coming from a younger version of her, like the seed of a plan I'd only ever seen in its final desperate stage. There were more letters, some to Mary, some started to Mom, and never finished. Little slices of thought frozen on the page. She wrote about saving tips from the diner in a coffee can behind the flower.
About Daniel coming home quiet one night, punching a hole in the bathroom door the next. About loving him and fearing what that love might cost. They weren't dramatic confessions, just small, careful admissions she'd tucked away down here where no one was meant to find them. I could hear the house above me as I read. A faint groan in the pipes, a car passing outside, tires hissing on the damp road. Every so often, a soft tap from somewhere in the walls that made me think of a heartbeat. Near the bottom of the box, under a manila folder full of recipes in her handwriting, her stew, her pie crust, notes like "too much salt last time" scribbled in the margins, I found a photograph. It had curled at the edges, the colors faded almost to sepia. I smoothed it gently against my thigh. The image was of the attic. I knew it even before my mind registered the details. The low slope of the roof beams, the narrow window in the background, squaring off a small piece of sky. A dented metal trunk pushed against one wall. In the center of the frame was a crate turned upside down, and on top of that crate, a single candle burning. Its flame was caught mid-slicker, a small, stubborn tongue of light in the dusty gloom. The wax had begun to pool at the base, a soft halo on the rough wood. To the right of the candle, leaning back against a beam, was my mother. Her face was turned up toward the rafters, eyes not quite on the camera. There was a tiny smile at the corner of her mouth, not the broad laugh she'd had at cookouts or birthdays, something smaller, private. Her hair fell loose around her shoulders, the ends catching the candlelight. She looked not happy exactly, but like someone who had found a pocket of air in a room that had been slowly filling with smoke. I flipped the photograph over. On the back, in the same looping script as the letters, were 9 words. When the light is right, you can see where the cracks really are. I traced the sentence with my thumb, the indentation of the pen still faintly there after all these years. It could have been a metaphor, just a thought she'd had about life, or marriage, or herself. She was always good with small, sharp phrases that stuck in your mind, but she'd written it on the back of a picture of the attic. Not the kitchen, not the river, not the front porch, the attic. The place our father told us not to go, the place my brother had locked like it might betray him if given the chance. I pictured her up there alone, arranging that crate, lighting that candle, angling herself just so. Who had taken the picture? Mark? A tripod? Or had she set a timer and trusted the camera to capture whatever truth it could in 10 seconds? Down in the basement, with the cold floor seeping into my knees and the dim bulb buzzing overhead, I felt the space above my head differently, not just as an off-limit storage room, but as something she had stood in, examined, documented. A room where she had gone to look for cracks. Was she only talking about beams and boards, about the way old houses shift and separate under their own weight? Or had she been quietly marking a place, a moment, where our family story would eventually split wide enough for the light to pour through? The refrigerator hummed on upstairs. The river moved steadily past the back of the house. I sat there with the photograph in my hands and my mother's words on my tongue, knowing that whatever lay locked above us, it wasn't just dust and bad insulation. It was the part of her my father had decided to keep, and my brother had decided to hide. The hallway to my father's room smelled like bleach and canned green beans. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, too bright, flattening every color into some version of white. A TV in a nearby room murmured a game show theme song, the applause track tinny and far away. Nurses' shoes squeaked softly against the waxed floor, a kind of polished, artificial sound you don't hear anywhere but in places where people are trying not to die. I stood outside his door for a moment with my hand on the metal handle, feeling the cool through my palm. Behind it, I could hear nothing. No TV, no radio. Just the faint, steady beep of a monitor and the soft whoosh of the air vent. I told myself I was just here to check on him, not to ask about an attic he'd warned me away from my whole life. Inside, his room was brighter than it needed to be. Sunlight pushed in through the narrow window and landed on the white bedsheets, making them look almost blue. The blinds were half open, strips of outside world cut into neat, manageable lines. My father lay propped up on 2 pillows, the paper-thin blanket pulled over his legs. Without the work boots and the kitchen chair and the authority of the house around him, he looked smaller. His shoulders didn't seem as broad. His chest rose and fell under the hospital gown in shallow, practiced breaths. But his eyes were the same, hard, dark, alert, like someone who had fallen down a flight of stairs and still didn't trust the landing. "Hey, Dad," I said, stepping in. He blinked, then focused on me. It took him half a second longer than it used to. "Lena," he said. The sound of my name in his mouth pulled something tight in my chest. "You made it." "Yeah." I dragged a vinyl chair closer to the bed. Its legs squealed against the linoleum. "Mark said you settled in here pretty well." He snorted, a dry, familiar sound. "Settled in. Like I'm a dog in a new kennel." His right hand tugged at the edge of the blanket, pinching the fabric between thumb and forefinger. The left lay still, heavy and disobedient on the sheet. Up close, the changes were clearer. The skin on his hands had thinned, spotted with age and IV tape marks.
There was a tremor at the corner of his mouth when he wasn't speaking. His hair, which was once thick and dark, had gone sparse, the scalp showing through in a way he would have hated. "How's the food?" I asked. It was the kind of question you ask when you don't know which ones you're allowed. He rolled his eyes toward the tray on the bedside table, a plastic cup of something beige sat half-finished. "They call that meatloaf," he said. "I've seen cardboard with more flavor." "So terrible?" I translated, and he gave me a ghost of the old half-smile. We circled like that for a while. His physical therapy, they got me walking like a drunk penguin down the hallway. The nurses, too young, all of them. No one over 25 should be in charge of this many pills. The weather, river's probably high as my roof by now. He didn't ask much about me. That was normal. My life existed in a different country in his mind, something reported by Mark in brief segments, not worth direct questions. The bag with my things sat on the floor by my chair, leather scuffed, zipper half open. Inside it, hidden under a scarf and my car keys, was the photograph I'd found in the basement. The attic, the candle, my mother's small, secret smile. Just knowing it was there made the room feel off balance, like I was holding something sharp in my lap. Eventually, the conversation slid, as it had to, toward the house. "They treating you all right?" I asked. "You warm enough at night?" He nodded once, eyes on the window. "Be warmer at home." "We're working on it, clearing things out, getting it ready." His gaze sharpened. "Mark's helping you?" "Yes." I watched his profile carefully. "We've done most of downstairs, closets, bedrooms." I paused, tried to make my voice light. "We'll have to clear the attic, too." The word hung there between us. Attic. 3 syllables, small and ordinary, but it changed the air in the room. His jaw tightened almost immediately. It was a minor movement, just a clinch, but on the smaller version of him, it looked bigger. His fingers stopped picking at the blanket. "There's nothing worth your time up there." He didn't look at me when he said it. His eyes slid to the window, to the narrow slice of parking lot, and thin line of trees beyond. "We still have to check," I replied. "Realtor's going to want everything emptied out." He shifted on the bed, the paper of his gown crinkling. "Mark already took care of it. After..." He swallowed, his throat moving slowly. "After your mother." He said "after" twice. The first time was smooth. The second one snagged on that missing word, the one he had to drag up from somewhere deep. Mother. It came out strained, like he'd forgotten how to shape it. "Took care of it," I repeated softly. "What does that mean, exactly?" He finally turned his head. The hardness in his eyes was back in full. "Means he did what needed doing," he said. "We cleaned out some things. Junk. No reason for you to go poking around up there." "Junk," I echoed. I thought of the new padlock on the hatch, how shiny it had looked against the old wood. Junk that needed to be locked away. He shifted again and winced, a small leak of pain around the mouth. His good hand went to his side, fingers pressing gently against the thin blanket, as if he could push the hurt back in. "This house," he said, voice lower now. "It's just wood and nails, Lena. People die. Things get left behind. You don't need to dig into every corner." I watched him for a long beat. The man who had once filled doorways, now contained by a metal bed rail, his world shrunk to the length of this room and the schedule on the whiteboard. "You always told us not to go up there," I said. "When we were kids." He snorted again. "Did you ever listen?" "Sometimes." I offered him a small smile that didn't quite reach my eyes. "But you never put a lock on it before." He blinked slow. The line between his brows deepened. "What are you talking about?" "There's a padlock on the attic hatch," I said. "A new one. Mark had to put it there." "You didn't?" He stared at me a second too long, like he was deciding how much to pretend. Then he let his gaze slide away again. "If he put a lock, he had a reason," he said. "He's been taking care of that place, not you." There it was again, that phrase, taking care. This time it sounded less like maintenance, more like burial. A nurse poked her head in then, checking the monitor, asking about his pain level on a scale of 1 to 10. He gave her a number lower than the way he was gripping the blanket told me it really was. She smiled and adjusted a drip, her ID badge swinging, and for a while the conversation was about dosages and schedules and insurance forms I hadn't seen. When she left, the room felt more crowded than it had before. I thought about reaching into my bag, pulling out that photograph of the attic, holding it up where he couldn't avoid it, asking him what cracks my mother was looking for up there. Whether he had seen that picture before he packed it into his Isabel Keep box and shoved it under his workbench like a bomb he didn't know how to disarm. Instead, I smoothed my skirt and folded my hands in my lap. We found some of Mom's things in the basement. Letters, recipes, a picture of the attic. His fingers stilled again. Basement's damp, he muttered. You shouldn't spend too much time down there. Is that what you're worried about? I asked before I could stop myself. The damp? His eyes flicked to mine then, just for a second, and in that second, I saw it, the smallest crack, a hairline fracture in the old certainty, guilt or fear or both, moving like something alive beneath thin ice. You always had an imagination, he said. It was meant to be dismissive, a father brushing away a child's question, but his voice didn't have the same weight it used to. Don't go making stories where there aren't any. Stories. I could have laughed at that if it hadn't made my skin prickle. For years we'd lived inside his version of our life, the one where accidents were accidents, tempers didn't leave bruises, and leaving was an insult, not a survival plan. Now the word story coming from his mouth sounded more like a warning than wisdom. We let the conversation drift after that, back to safer ground. He asked if the old grocery store still carried that terrible instant coffee he liked. I told him about traffic in the city, the construction near my apartment, the smallness of my kitchen. We avoided the attic the way you avoid pressing on a bruise. When visiting hours finally clicked over on the big digital clock at the nurse's station, I stood up and smoothed the wrinkles out of my coat. My bag felt heavier when I picked it up, the strap biting into my shoulder. At the door, I turned back. We'll get the house in order. You just focus on walking better than a drunk penguin. That almost smile tugged at his mouth again. Tell your brother not to throw out my tools. He gets overzealous. Overzealous. Another word for erasing. In the hallway, the nurse from earlier was refilling a cart with small plastic cups and pill bottles. She looked up and smiled. The kind that's been practiced so much, it still manages to be kind. You're Daniel's daughter, right? Yeah. He talks about you. And your brother. Especially him. Mark is here all the time. Helps fill out forms, brings in special food when your dad won't eat ours. She lowered her voice slightly, a conspiratorial softness. He's very devoted. Like he's trying to make up for something he'll never say. The words lodged under my ribs. I thanked her and walked out into the cold, the automatic doors hissing closed behind me. The daylight outside felt thinner than the fluorescent light inside, more honest in its chill. In the parking lot, I sat in the car for a moment before starting the engine. The photograph called to me from the bag, like a small, insistent weight. I pulled it out and laid it on the steering wheel. The attic. The candle. My mother's face turned up to the dark beams. Through the windshield, I could see the rehab center windows reflected in the car hood, rows of rectangles stacked on top of each other. Somewhere behind one of those, my father lay in his bed repeating a line about nothing worth your time up there. Somewhere across town, my brother moved through our house with the key to that new padlock heavy in his pocket. If both of them had spent years guarding the same empty space, locking it, labeling it, warning me away from it, then whatever waited above that ceiling was more than junk and bad insulation. As I turned the key in the ignition, I couldn't shake the feeling that the real cracks in our story were not in the walls of that house, but in the silence two men were doing everything they could to keep nailed shut.
By late afternoon, the rain had stopped being polite. It came at the house in long, slanting sheets, rattling the windows in their frames until the glass buzzed under my fingertips. The yard outside was no longer grass and dirt and flower beds. It was just action. Blurred streaks of water, the dark shape of the maple tree bending, the river somewhere beyond it, hidden but loud. Inside, the light gave up early. The sky outside was still technically day, but the rooms folded into shadow as if evening had fallen all at once. I moved through the house flicking on lamps, little islands of yellow that didn't quite reach the corners. The storm made everything sound closer. The attic, my own heartbeat. I'd left my father at the rehab center with his small, hard denials still ringing in my ears. Now his words rode home with me, sat with me at the kitchen table, followed me from room to room. There's nothing worth your time up there. Mark already took care of it. That phrase had been looping in my head all afternoon. Took care of it. Like the attic was an animal that had needed putting down. The box from the basement. Isabel Keep. Sat on a chair in the kitchen, its cardboard darkened in patches from old damp. My bag was on the table, the photograph of the attic tucked inside, the edge of it pressing into my palm when I rested my hand there. Mark was in the living room, TV on but muted, the soft blue light flashing against his face every few seconds. A can of beer sweated on the coffee table, leaving a faint ring. His eyes weren't on the screen, they were on the middle distance, on something only he could see. "Storm's really coming down," I called, more to break the spell than to share news. "Yeah," he said without turning. "They said it might flood near the bridge. River's used to it. It'll find somewhere to go." He hummed, a non-committal sound, the kind you make when you've heard words but not taken them in. A low roll of thunder moved across the sky, distant but real. The house shivered slightly, or maybe that was just me. I looked at the closed attic hatch in the hall, then back at the box on the chair. You can only circle a fault line for so long before you have to decide whether to step over it or jump. "Mark?" I tried again. "Yeah? Can you come in here a second?" There was a pause. The show on the TV shifted scenes, faces changing in silent motion. Then I heard the couch springs complain as he stood up, the soft thud of his boots on the floor. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, one hand automatically finding the frame like he needed something solid to hold. "What's up?" he asked. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I pulled the box closer, lifted the flaps, and began laying things out on the table between us. First, the bundle of letters. Edges yellowed, rubber band long since snapped. Then the recipe cards, my mother's looping handwriting curling across each one like a voice that had never quite quieted. Finally, the photograph. I set it down last, face up, right in the center of the table, the candle flame in it flickering against old attic beams. For a moment, the only sound was the rain against the windows and the refrigerator humming like a held note. Mark's eyes went straight to the photograph. He froze. Not a big, dramatic freeze, just a small stillness that started in his shoulders and spread outward like someone had pressed pause. "I found these in the basement," I said, keeping my voice gentle. "In a box Dad labeled Isabel Keep." His jaw worked once. He didn't reach for anything. His hands stayed at his sides. "You've been busy," he said, but it came out flat. "Did you know he'd packed away her letters?" I touched the top page lightly. "These are from before we were born. She was writing to Aunt Marie, to Grandma. She was making plans." He let out a short breath through his nose, something like a laugh with all the humor scraped out. "Mom always made plans. Not like this." I slid one of the letters toward him, the inked words about squirreling away enough for a new start, visible if he'd let himself look. She was talking to a lawyer, Mark, about leaving him, not running off in the middle of the night, doing it properly. The thunder rumbled again, closer this time. The light over the sink flickered, then steadied. He finally stepped forward. His fingers brushed the edge of the table, then curled into a fist. He glanced at the letter, then away, eyes landing on the photograph as if pulled there by something heavy. "What do you want me to say?" he asked. "How about the truth?" I said. The words were soft, almost a suggestion.
About the attic, about that night. He stared at the image of our mother sitting in that dusty space, face turned up towards something we couldn't see. He swallowed. "She was going to take you," he said finally. Short, clipped, like he'd practiced this sentence. "Both of us, really, but mostly you. She said she'd leave in the middle of the night if she had to, said I had to choose." The rain hit the side of the house harder, a new angle of wind driving it against the siding. The sound filled the pause between his words. "I was 17, he went on. Dad, you know how he was then. She tells me she's got money hidden, she's been talking to people, she's leaving, and I need to come with her or stay. You choose who you are with, not him, remember?" His mouth tightened around the quote, like it was that simple. I remembered, her hand on his, the envelope, the way his shoulders had looked under the porch light. "So you told him," I said. He flinched, just a little. "I told him she was planning something, that she was talking about taking you in the middle of the night, not telling anyone, tearing the family apart." "Tearing the family apart," I repeated. The phrase felt like a coat he'd tried on so many times it had molded to his body. That's how he said it, isn't it? He let out a tight breath. "Maybe. I don't know, it was a long time ago, Lena." "You remember enough to put a lock on the attic," I said quietly. "Enough to clean it out. Dad said you took care of it after she died." His eyes flashed up at mine then, sharper. "He said that?" Yeah. For a moment, something raw moved across his face. Then it smoothed out again, into that old, unreadable mask. She had all her stuff up there. Notes, boxes, pictures like that. He nodded toward the photograph. Plans to leave. I went up after, cleared it out. It was Dad's idea and mine. We didn't want you going up there thinking she was some kind of... He stopped himself. Started again. We didn't want you seeing her that way. What way? My voice was barely more than a whisper now. The storm had become a wall of noise outside, but in the kitchen, everything felt strangely hushed. Reckless, he said. Ready to run, to just pull us out of there without thinking what it would do. To him, to you. His fingers tapped once against the table, a small, restless gesture. You were 16. You needed stability. Stability. The house that shook with yelling, the car that never came back. I looked down at the letters, at the careful sentences about lawyers and accounts and fear, at the photograph. My mother sitting cross-legged under the beams, candle burning on the crate like a small, deliberate act of light. None of this looks reckless, I said. It looks like someone trying very hard to do things right. He shifted his weight, the floorboard under his right foot creaking. You're reading old scraps of paper. You weren't in the kitchen that night. You didn't hear her. I heard plenty from the stairs, I said, before I could stop myself. Thunder cracked then, loud and immediate, making both of us jump. The light above us flickered once, twice. On the third flicker, it went out. The hum of the refrigerator died with it. The house exhaled into sudden darkness. For a moment, neither of us moved. The rain kept going, relentless, drumming against the windows, running down the gutters. The only other sound was his breathing across from me, a little faster than before, uneven. In the blackout, I couldn't see his face, just the vague shape of him a day. Shadow against the dim, storm-colored light seeping around the edges of the curtains. Great, he said softly. Power's out. But his voice didn't sound annoyed. It sounded thin, like someone standing at the edge of something they couldn't quite see the bottom of. Without the light, his practiced words hung differently in the air. She was going to tear the family apart. We took care of it. We didn't want you seeing her that way. They didn't land as solid facts anymore. They trembled, just a little, like they were balancing on a fault line instead of bedrock. You really believe that, don't you? I said into the dark. That you were protecting me. He let out a breath that could have been a laugh if it hadn't broken halfway through. What else was I supposed to do? He asked. She put me in the middle. I picked the person who wasn't talking about disappearing. And then she disappeared anyway, I said. The silence after that sentence felt different. He didn't fill it. Neither did I. Up above us, somewhere, beyond the ceiling and the locked hatch, the structure of the house creaked in the wind, old boards shifting, nails remembering they were separate pieces once. I thought of my mother's note on the back of the photograph. When the light is right, you can see where the cracks really are. Now, in the dark, those cracks felt closer. Not in the plaster, in the story I'd been told for 16 years. That she was unstable, impulsive, that his betrayal had been a twisted act of love, and the attic was a mercy to me instead of a graveyard to her. Rainwater hammered the roof. The storm outside showed no sign of moving on. Across the table, my brother's outlines shivered just enough for me to notice. If this was the whole truth, I thought, fingers brushing the photograph I could no longer see, why did it shake so badly when the lights went out?
The dark in that house didn't fall all at once. It thickened. After the lights went out, the storm outside pressed its gray hands against every window, and what little daylight we had left sank into the walls. For a few long seconds, there was nothing. No TV glow, no overhead hum, just the sound of rain drilling the roof and the quiet, uneven pull of Mark's breathing across from me at the kitchen table. I could feel him there more than see him, a heavier shadow against the rest. Hold on, he muttered. His chair scraped back, legs grating against the linoleum. I've got flashlights somewhere. He moved by memory. Drawers opening with sharp metallic clacks, wooden spoons and old rubber bands rattling inside. A faint beam cut through the dark for a second, then sputtered and died. Damn batteries, he said under his breath. The second flashlight lasted longer, maybe 5 seconds. Its weak cone skimming over the refrigerator door, the sink, the outline of my hands folded on the table, before it too went to a dull, defeated glow, and then nothing. He stood there in the dark for a moment.
I heard the small huff of breath through his nose. Then a drawer I recognized by sound, the one with junk, the one that always stuck halfway, gave a reluctant groan. A beat later, I smelled it before I saw it. A brief hiss, the scratch of a match, then the warm, sweet tang of sulfur and melting wax. The first candle he lit was thick and white, the kind my mother used to put out when company came. Its flame shivered, then steadied, casting a low orange circle on the countertop. He lit a second one off the first, tipping the wick until it caught. That twin flame sprang up brighter, eager, and for a moment the kitchen looked like the memory of itself. "That's better," he said, though his voice didn't sound convinced. He set one candle in the middle of the table, close enough that I could feel a little warmth on my knuckles. The other he kept in his hand, the wax already starting to gloss near his fingers. The smell of melted wax and faint smoke curled into the air, mixing with the damp creeping in from the storm, wet leaves, old wood gone slightly sour. In the candlelight, shadows weren't just absence. They had edges, shapes. The hallway behind him looked longer than it did in daylight, a tunnel where the dark pooled. "You stay put," he said, lifting the candle. "Breakers probably tripped. I'll check outside." "The storm," I started. He cut me off with a small tilt of his head toward the window. "It's not lightning now, just rain. I'll be quick." He moved toward the back door, the circle of light traveling with him, licking over cabinet faces, catching the shine of the fridge handle, making the metal sink wink once and then disappear. When he opened the door, a blade of cold, wet air pushed in, cooling the sweat on my neck. Then the door shut behind him and I heard his boots on the porch, the muted thud as he went down the steps. The kitchen was quieter without him. The single candle on the table burned with a soft, steady patience. Its flame tipped and straightened in tiny movements you only notice when nothing else is asking for your attention. I stood up slowly, the chair legs scraping, and picked up the candle by its base. A small ring of melted wax had already started to pool there, warm and pliable under my fingertips. I wrapped my other hand around the glass to steady it and stepped into the hallway. The light moved with me, an orange arc that brushed the walls, made the framed photos blink in and out of existence as I passed. My fourth-grade school picture flashed into being, crooked bangs, forced smile, and then was swallowed again. My parents' wedding photo caught the glow for half a second, my mother's veil turned to a pale flare of white, my father's face sinking back into gray. The floor creaked under my bare feet like it remembered me. The further I went, the more the candle changed what I thought I knew. Corners seemed deeper. The narrowness of the hall pressed closer. The old runner rug looked darker, its pattern blurred to almost nothing. Overhead, the ceiling floated just out of reach, shadowed except for one interrupted square of light, right in front of me. The attic hatch. In daylight, it was just a shape, a fading outline. Now, in the candle's shifting glow, it felt awake. A piece of wood framed by older wood, the metal latch catching the flicker like a closed eye opening and closing. I stopped beneath it and lifted the candle a little higher. The wax had begun to drip down one side, a slow, translucent tear. Up close, I could see things I hadn't before. Tiny scratches around the latch, bright and raw against the older paint, where metal had scraped wood not long ago. A faint ring of cleaner paint, where the frame didn't sit quite flush with the ceiling, as if the hatch had been lifted, shifted, put back slightly crooked by hands that weren't used to it. Fresh. Recent. Not 16 years old. My fingers tightened around the glass. The flame leaned with my breath and steadied again. My mother's photograph floated up in my mind. The dented trunk, the candle on the crate, her face turned up toward rafters. When the light is right, you can see where the cracks really are. Here, now, under this hatch, the light was not quite right, but it was enough to see that something had moved. From outside, through the thick walls and thicker rain, I heard Mark's muffled curse, the dull clang of the breaker box door. He was still out there, still occupied. I set the candle down carefully on the floor against the wall, its circle of safety shrinking as it dropped. Then I turned and went back to the dining room. The chairs waited around the table, their shadows long and bent in the low light filtering from the kitchen. I grabbed the nearest one and dragged it into the hall. Its wooden legs bumped over the rug, caught on a warped board, then slid into place beneath the hatch. My heart was beating faster than the stairs deserved. It sounded too loud in my ears, competing with the rain and the distant metallic click of something outside. I tested the chair with one foot, then climbed up, the wood shifting just slightly under my weight. From that height, the ceiling felt close, almost intimate. The candle's light reached higher now, gilding the edges of the hatch, making the new padlock glint. Up close, the lock looked even more out of place. Bright brass, no tarnish, the numbers clean and sharp on the body. A modern thing grafted onto this old house like a foreign organ. The screws that held the latch were silver, not the dull gray of the original hardware. Two of them sat just a hair proud out of the surface, their heads not quite flush, like someone had run out of patience before finishing. I reached up and pressed my palm flat against the boards beside the latch. The paint was cool and a little rough under my skin. Beneath that, the wood had that smoothness that comes with years of being part of a structure, settled, resigned. But when I shifted my weight and pushed, there was a give.
Not much. A millimeter, maybe less. Enough to feel the screws flex in their holes. Enough to know this had been disturbed recently and not quite fixed back the way it had been. I pushed a little harder. The board shivered under my hand. A tiny cracking sound, not of breaking wood, but of old paint letting go around the nails. For a second, the temptation was a physical thing. It ran from my palm, down my arm, into my shoulder. A simple math. A little more force, a twist, maybe a shove with the heel of my hand, and the seal would crack. The lock might still hold, but the frame would show its weakness. The house would have to yield something. My promise to Mark from 16 years ago, whispered at the foot of these same stairs, rose up with it. His face then, gray and young and collapsing. His voice saying, "I betrayed her. This is on me. Promise you won't tell." Down the hall, the candle on the floor cast my shadow up the wall, stretching my arm into something longer, thinner, reaching for too much. Outside, I heard Mark's boots on the porch steps. The familiar, slow ascent. 1, 2, pause. The slight jangle of keys in his pocket. I stayed there, hand on the hatch, feeling the building hold its breath around me. I thought of my father's jaw tightening when I'd said, "Attic." Of the nurse's gentle words about Mark being devoted, like he's trying to make up for something he'll never say. Of my mother's letters carefully hidden. Of the box labeled Isabel Keep, like a decision and a command, all at once. The screws under my palm quivered again, with the tiniest movement of the boards. Not enough to see, just enough to know. I could put my shoulder into it, I thought. I could brace one hand on the frame, lean my weight up and forward, let the years of not knowing break along with the paint. By the time Mark opened the door, it would be done. He'd have to look at whatever spilled out with me. His footsteps were at the door now. The metallic rattle of the knob turning cut through the rain's steady percussion. The house felt suddenly smaller, every sound close. Let my hand fall. It dropped slowly, fingers trailing down the rough wood, brushing over the cold curve of the padlock as it passed. I climbed down from the chair, my socks whispering against the seat, then the floor. When I bent to pick up the candle, a small spill of wax ran over the rim onto my fingers, hot enough to sting. The back door opened. A gust of cold, damp air swept into the kitchen, making the candle flame shudder in my grasp. "Breaker's blown," Mark called, his voice edged with frustration and something else. "Half the block's out. They'll fix it when they fix it, I guess." I blew gently on my burned fingertips and turned toward the light of the kitchen, the chair behind me, a small, silent witness, left standing in the hallway. As I stepped back into that pool of orange, his shape filled the doorway, hair damp, jacket speckled with rain. His eyes flicked up the hallway, pausing for the briefest moment on the moved chair, then dropping back to the candle in my hand. "You all right?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. "Just didn't want to trip over anything in the dark." He nodded slowly, not quite convinced, but not pushing. He smiled, but not with his eyes. I set the candle back on the table, its flames steadying again, pretending it hadn't seen what my hand had felt. The storm kept talking to the house, fingers drumming on the roof, sliding down the siding in long, restless lines. As Mark moved past me toward the fridge, the chair still stood under the attic hatch, a small, crooked ladder to a door I'd chosen, for now, not to open. I watched his back, the set of his shoulders, and felt the question settle heavy in my chest. How many more times could I climb back down from that threshold before I had to admit I wasn't just protecting myself from what was above the ceiling? I was protecting him from the light that might finally show where the real cracks were. When the door opened, the candlelight caught me first. I was already up on the chair under the hatch, one hand braced against the ceiling, the other curled around the warm glass of the candle, when the back door creaked and let in a slice of cold, wet air. The flame wavered, reaching toward the draft. I turned my head, just enough to see him. Mark stood in the kitchen doorway, rain still clinging to his jacket in dark patches. His hair was damp, pushed back from his forehead. For a second, he looked less like my brother and more like some startled animal, frozen at the edge of a clearing, eyes reflecting the light. He didn't say anything. His gaze went from the chair to my hand on the hatch to the candle held up near the crooked frame. The storm outside had quieted to a steady whisper, and in that thin silence I could hear his breath catch. I felt suddenly stupid and exposed, a kid caught with her hand in the cookie jar, a grown woman caught doing the one thing she'd promised long ago never to do. I started, but the sentence didn't know where to go. He stood there, jaw tight, rainwater dripping from the cuff of his jacket to the floor, small dark spots blooming on the linoleum. The candle in my hand hissed once as a dot of melted wax hit my skin. I didn't flinch. The moment stretched out, thin and brittle. Then he exhaled. It was a long, slow sound, exhausted more than angry. "Get down," he said quietly. His voice wasn't sharp. That scared me more than if he'd yelled. I climbed off the chair, feet finding the floor with a soft thud. My socks had picked up dust from the hallway runner. The candlelight swung as I moved, throwing our shadows long and strange against the walls. He stepped closer, bringing his own candle with him. 2 small flames now, side by side, pushing the dark back just far enough for us to see each other's faces. He set his candle on the floor beneath the hatch, then took mine and placed it beside it. The light rose up between us like a small, reluctant campfire. Without a word, he reached up and ran his fingers along the padlock. The brass caught the light, flaring briefly as if it wanted attention. His thumb rested on the cold curve for a second, then he dug into his pocket of his jeans and pulled out a small key, strung on a ring with 3 others and a bent bottle opener. I was going to... He began, then stopped. The words didn't seem to matter anymore. The key slid into the lock with a soft metallic sigh. For years, that little door in the ceiling had been an unspoken rule, a line you didn't cross. Now I watched as he put his hand on the thing that kept it shut and turned. The click was louder than it should have been. It cut through the rain-muted house, sharp and final, the kind of sound you feel in your teeth. He caught the falling lock in his palm, the weight of it a small, heavy thud against skin. For a moment his fist closed around it, knuckles whitening, then he dropped it into my open hand. The metal was still cool, denser than it looked. "Hold on to that," he said. "If we're doing this, we're doing it." He didn't look at me when he said it. His eyes were already on the hatch. He dragged the chair back under the frame and climbed up, joints creaking in protest. I watched his hand find the edge of the wood, fingers curling over, wrist flexing as he pulled. The hatch came down with a dry, reluctant sigh, a sprinkle of dust drifting into the candlelight like brown snow. The smell hit me first when the attic opened. Not fresh anything, old air, dry and stale with the faint acidic bite of insulation and the ghost of mouse droppings. The rain was louder up here, but muffled, like someone drumming on a closed box. Mark unfolded the narrow ladder, its hinges groaning. He went up first, candle in hand, his shadow shrinking and stretching along the sloped ceiling as he disappeared through the square. For a heartbeat, I just stood there, looking up at the dark opening he'd vanished into. The padlock lay heavy in my hand, colder now. "Come on," his voice floated down. "Watch your head." I set the lock gently on the dining chair, as if it might bruise, then picked up the second candle and followed. The ladder flexed under my weight, old wood complaining softly. My head rose level with the ceiling, then through it, into the low space beyond. I had to duck immediately. The roof dipped, forcing my shoulders forward. The attic wasn't tall, just a long sloping wedge of space under the roof, the beams crossing overhead like dark ribs. My candle threw thin golden lines across them as I moved. The air was different up here.
Clothes dry in a way that sucked the moisture from your mouth. It tasted of dust and old fiber, of summers collected and never aired out. My mind had always filled this space with stuff. Trunks, boxes, forgotten Christmas decorations, the kind of clutter that grows in the dark when no one is looking. But it was bare. No trunk in the center, like in the photograph. No towers of boxes, no old suitcases. Just the rough boards of the floor and long, wide smears where dust had been recently erased. Clean streaks, clear paths where something big had once sat and wasn't there anymore. Our candles traced the outlines of absences. Mark crouched a few feet ahead of me, knees popping, his free hand on the floor for balance. He didn't move around much, just turned in a slow circle, light shifting. His face looked odd in the upward shadows, older and younger at the same time. "It was full," he said quietly, more to the air than to me. After that night, it was full." "What was here?" I asked. He shook his head once, a quick, tight motion. "Doesn't matter now, it's gone." I looked at the clean spaces, the long rectangular shape where a trunk might have been, the rounder patch where maybe a box had sat, undisturbed for years.
The rest of the floor was covered in an even layer of dust, fine and gray, except for our footprints had begun to mark it. "Who moved it?" I asked. "You?" He didn't answer. The roof sloped lower toward the back of the attic, forcing us to crawl to go any further. We sank to our knees, candles held out in front like offerings, the rough boards scraping at our jeans. As we moved, little clouds of dust puffed up around our hands, sparkling briefly in the candlelight before settling back down. The sound of the storm became a steady thud above us, a slow heartbeat pressed through shingles and tar paper. In the far corner, where the roofline met the floor, something dark caught my eye. It was no larger than a dinner plate, a faint, blackened circle on the boards. Not fresh, not wet, just a shadow burned into the wood long ago. I shifted closer, setting my candle down beside it, its flame leaning slightly toward the mark. The circle was irregular around the edges, the pattern of heat having soaked into the boards. In the center, the wood was slightly sunken, as if softened and hardened again by time. It looked exactly like what it was, the place where a candle had burned and burned, too long in one spot, until it left a memory. Beside it, almost invisible at first glance, was a narrow panel of wood. At a distance, it blended in with the rest of the floor, but up close, you could see how the grain ran differently, how the nails sat just a little more evenly. It was cut in a slim rectangle, about the width of my hand, spanning the space between two joists. "This is new," I murmured. Mark blinked, pulled out of some internal calculation. "What?" I put my palm on the panel, fingers spread. The wood was smoother than the boards around it, less splintered. I pressed gently. For a second, nothing happened. Then, with a small resistance and a dry, complaining groan, the panel swung inward on a hidden hinge. The sound reminded me of a throat cleared before a confession. A breath of cooler air spilled out, carrying with it a deeper, stiller dust. We both paused, candles lifted, peering into the dark slit I'd opened. Inside was barely more than a crawl space. The light slid in and revealed a narrow compartment between the beams, just tall enough for a hand to reach into. No shelves, no walls, just the raw skeleton of the house, and, nestled against one side, two shapes. A metal box, gunmetal gray, edges dulled with age. Next to it, an old shoebox, the cardboard sagging slightly, but intact, its lid still on. They were coated in a thin, even film of dust, untouched by the recent rearranging that had emptied the rest of the attic. It was the dust that convinced me. Whatever had been dragged out of here, whatever Mark had taken care of, no one had moved these. My heart thudded in my ears, a separate storm. I reached in slowly. Spiderweb silk brushed my knuckles, soft and resisting. I pulled the metal box out first, its weight solid and cold, and set it carefully on the floor between us. The shoebox came next, lighter, something shifting faintly inside when I moved it. Mark watched my hands. He didn't try to stop me. He didn't help either. His candlelight shook just enough to make the shadows tremble. "I didn't know about that," he said roughly. I believed him. Not because I trusted everything that came out of his mouth, but because of the way his eyes wouldn't leave the boxes, like they were wild animals that might leap. We knelt there under the sloping roof, two grown children in a house that had never quite let us be adults, with these small, plain objects between us on the dust-covered floor. The metal box clicked faintly as it settled, something shifting inside against its walls. The shoebox lid had a faint water stain in one corner, like someone's thumb had once rested there too long. Down below, the world kept going. The refrigerator would be sitting silent in the dark kitchen. The front yard would be a blur of wet motion. The river would be moving past, indifferent, the way it always had. Up here, time narrowed to this: the smell of dust and wax, the soft rasp of our breathing, the way my mother's photograph had shown this room full and alive and waiting, and the way now, even scrubbed almost clean, it had held back one last thing in a secret pocket of its ribs. I looked at Mark. His face was pale in the candlelight, lines deeper than his age and mouth pressed thin. "Ias, is it?" I asked quietly. "What you've been locking up all these years?" His eyes flicked from the boxes to the open panel, to the blackened circle where a single candle had burned and burned, marking the spot. For a fraction of a second, I saw a boy again, instead of the tired man, a 17-year-old who'd been asked to choose, and had spent every day since trying to build a story he could live with. "I don't know," he said, and it sounded honest. "I didn't put it there." The candle beside us sputtered once, then steadied. I rested my hand on the metal lid, feeling the chill of it seep into my palm, and thought of my mother up here alone, tucking something away between the bones of the house, trusting wood and dust and time more than the people under her roof. Was this the secret Mark was so afraid of? The one that might finally break his version of her? Or was it something she'd meant for both of us? A message sealed away for the day when we were finally brave. Or desperate, enough to climb up into the dark and ask the house what it knew.
The tape was smaller than my palm. It lay at the bottom of the metal box, in a cracked plastic case gone cloudy with age, half buried beneath papers that smelled like old ink and dry air. The label was curling at one corner, my mother's handwriting slanting across it in blue pen. A date, 2 days before she died. For a long moment, neither of us reached for it. The candles between us burned low and steady, their flames bowing just slightly toward each other, as if they were sharing a secret of their own. The attic around us stayed close and dry. The storm's voice softened to a distant hush above the roof. Dust moved lazily in the thin lanes of light, like it had all the time in the world. We sat cross-legged on the boards, facing each other with the box between us and the years behind us. When we'd first pried the lid open, the metal had given way with a reluctant squeal, like it hadn't expected to be asked anything else. Inside, everything was arranged too carefully to be an accident. Folders stacked in a neat row, envelopes tucked sideways, names and addresses written with the same looping patience I'd seen on recipe cards and school notes. They weren't love letters. They were something colder and braver. The first document I unfolded had a heading in black print, Petition for Legal Separation. Underneath, my mother's name, my father's. A town name that wasn't ours, a neighboring place just far enough away that people might not talk. I read the first lines in silence. Words like custody and division of assets and best interest of the children stared back at me, steady as bricks. Next to me, Mark shifted. The floor creaked under his knee. "What is it?" he asked. I handed the page to him without answering and reached for the next. Correspondence with a lawyer, letters on thick paper, a name and address at the top, paragraphs in tight professional type, and in the margins, my mother's notes in pen, questions, dates, a circled phrase, temporary orders, underlined twice. She'd written in small letters near the bottom of one page, "Can't argue with his temper. Can prove the debts. Is that enough?" The room felt even smaller reading that, like the beams had dipped a little lower. Mark's eyes moved over the petition, his face going slack in that way it did when he was trying not to show anything. The candlelight made it hard to tell what was shadow and what was change. "She filed this?" he asked, voice rough. "It's a draft. Look, there's no court stamp. Maybe she was about to. Maybe she was waiting on something." Another document confirmed it. A letter from the lawyer thanking her for the initial retainer payment, outlining next steps. A list of documents she'd need to gather. Bank statements, titles, W-2 forms, evidence. Evidence. The word sat heavy on my tongue. Tucked in the back of the stack was a folded sheet in her hand, accounts Daniel doesn't know about. She'd numbered them neatly, one at a credit union in town, one at a bank near her sister, savings amounts written beside each in tiny, careful digits. For kids, she'd added next to one. For move, next to another. A small arrow pointed to the total at the bottom. Enough to leave, not enough to be comfortable. Enough to try. All the while, Mark watched the pile grow, his shoulders inching higher with each new page. "She wasn't leaving in the middle of the night," I said quietly. "Not the way you said." He didn't look at me. He stared at the accounts list like it might rearrange itself if he kept his eyes on it long enough. "She told me," he swallowed. "She said, I'll go, with or without him. I won't wait on a judge to give me permission to protect my kids." Maybe she said both. Maybe this, I tapped the stack, was her first choice. He didn't answer. At the very bottom of the box, under insurance papers yellowed at the edges, was a single envelope with no stamp. On the front, in her neat script, were the words, "If anything happens before I can leave." My hands shook a little when I opened it. The letter inside was dated the week before she died. 3 pages. She'd started with our names, Mark and Lena, side by side at the top, as if we were still small enough to be called together. She wrote about the house, about the river, about how long she had tried to keep it all standing. She wrote about love and fear, and how the two can weave themselves together so tightly it's hard to know which is which. She didn't call my father a monster. She didn't call him a good man, either. She called him a man who doesn't know what to do with the rage he inherited. She wrote about wanting to break that line. For us. "This is not about running away in the night," she underlined. "This is about walking out in daylight, with the law and the truth behind me." When I finished, I realized I'd been holding my breath. I let it out slowly, the air feeling thicker coming back in. She had a plan, a measured one. Not perfect, but careful. Mark had his head down, the letter about the accounts limp in his hand. The candle between us flickered, its wax puddling at the base, a soft, slow collapse. "She still asked me to choose," he murmured. "That part's true." Yeah, that part's true. And then there was the tape.
It had sunk into a groove at the very bottom of the box, like everything else had been built on top of it. The cracked plastic case squeaked a little when I opened it. Inside, the cassette was intact. The label was simple: a date, my mother's initials, A and I, attic. I turned it over in my hands, the spools inside catching the candlelight in dull glints.
"Do you still have a way to play this?" I asked. Mark blinked like I'd woken him. "In the truck," he said slowly. "Old tape deck I pulled from Dad's garage. I was going to scrap it." He looked at the cassette. "Guess that can wait." We left the metal box and the shoebox where they were, candles marking their place like patient guards. Climbing back down the attic ladder into the dark hallway, the air felt wetter, heavier, as if the house had been holding its own breath too. In the kitchen, the storm had calmed to a steady drizzle. The power was still out. The one candle left on the table threw long, soft shadows up the walls. Mark grabbed his keys from the bowl by the door without a word and disappeared onto the porch. The screen door creaked. His footsteps faded. Alone for a moment, I stood with the tape in my hand. It was such a small thing to be carrying so much. When he came back, he held the old tape player like something half broken, half saved. Beige plastic, a little yellowed, an old radio with a cassette slot and a handle worn smooth from use years before. "Needs batteries," he muttered. We found some in the junk drawer. Miraculously, they worked. The player crackled to life with a faint hiss when he flipped the switch to on. The tiny speaker gave a low, empty hum. "Ready?" he asked. "No," I said. "Put it in anyway." There was something ritualistic about the way he did it, pressing the eject button, the compartment popping open with a familiar clack, sliding the tape in, label facing up, closing it with a small, decisive push. His fingers hovered over the play button for a second, then he pressed down. At first, there was only the soft roar of tape on heads, the tiny mechanical whir of the spools turning, a hiss like distant rain on pavement. For a moment, I thought maybe the years had eaten whatever she'd tried to say, and then her voice rose up out of the little speaker and into the kitchen. It was quieter than I remembered, lower, like all the notes had shifted down a step. "If you're hearing this," she began, "it means I did something I was scared to do." She laughed, very softly. The sound crackled through the static, still unmistakably hers. Mark's hand clenched on the edge of the table. He didn't look at me. I didn't look at him. We both kept our eyes on the little rectangle of plastic between us, as if her voice might climb out of it and need a place to land. "I'm in the attic," she went on. "You know that already, probably. It's quieter up here. Your father doesn't like the dust. Maybe that's why I do." There was a pause. We could hear her breathing, a little fast, a little uneven. "I forgive you, Mark," she said, and those words landed in that dim kitchen like stones dropped in shallow water. "Even if you told him everything, even if you think you cost me my chance, you didn't build this cage. You were just born inside it." My own breath hitched. I hadn't realized I'd been waiting to hear something for myself until she said his name instead of mine. "Lena," she added, softer. "You're probably listening too. You always did listen when you weren't supposed to." There was a smile in her voice then. I could see it, even if I couldn't see her face. "I hope you know none of this was your fault. Not the money, not his anger, not my staying too long or leaving too late." The house seemed to lean in around us. "Maybe one day, when the right light hits this room, you'll both understand why I did what I did, why I hid what I hid. It wasn't to shut you out. It was to leave you a door that he couldn't lock." The words "right light" made something cold slide down my spine. I saw the photograph again in my mind, the attic beams, the single candle, her small smile turned up to the rafters. The note on the back about cracks and light and seeing what's really there. The tape hissed on for a few seconds after she stopped speaking. Then a small click signaled the end of the side. The player kept whirring a moment before the auto-stop thunked and everything went quiet again. We sat there with the machine between us, its little red play button still depressed. The candle almost burned down to a stug. Mark finally blinked and sat back. His face looked like someone had taken sandpaper to it from the inside. "She forgave me," he said, like he couldn't quite believe the shape of the words. "She forgave me before she even knew what I'd done." I stared at the tape, at the way the reels had wound all her fear and hope and love into that small spool. Forgiveness, it turned out, was heavier than the lock we'd taken off the attic door. It didn't erase anything. It didn't hand us an easy villain or a simple story to carry forward. It just sat there, between us, asking quietly what we were going to do with it now. Her voice was gone again, back in the plastic and the dust and the years. The house creaked once high above, the sound traveling down through beams and boards like a reminder. The candle flickered, fought the dark, and steadied.
How do you live with a forgiveness you never asked for? I didn't know. But as I reached out and pressed stop, feeling the button click under my fingertip, I had the uneasy sense that whatever answer we chose would decide what kind of people we became after we finally walked out of that house.
By the time the storm ran out of excuses, the candles were mostly gone. Up in the attic, the last stubs leaned in their own puddles of wax, flames thin and stubborn, fighting off the gray that seeped in through the small window. Morning had arrived without asking permission. Pale light slid through the dirty glass and turned the dust in the air into slow-moving stars. It caught on the edges of the metal box, the cracked cassette case, the folded letters spread between us like a makeshift map. We hadn't moved in a long time. My legs had gone numb. The house felt different, like it had finally said everything it had been holding. Mark sat opposite me, back against a beam, knees drawn up, hands hanging over them. His eyes were ringed in shadow, face hollowed out by the hours and by what we just heard. The little tape player sat between us, its buttons still, the cassette inside it wound back into itself. My mother's voice had faded from the tiny speaker, but it hadn't gone anywhere. It seemed to live in the boards now, in the space between us. For a while after the tape clicked off, we'd said nothing. There was nothing safe to say. The storm outside had ebbed from pounding to a tired drizzle, then to scattered taps, then to nothing at all. Somewhere in the middle of that, the clock in the dining room downstairs had ticked over to morning, but time didn't feel like it belonged to us yet. My throat was raw, not from talking, but from holding words back. "She forgave me," he'd said once, almost to himself, and then he'd gone quiet again, staring past my shoulder into some dark corner of the attic where only he could see. Now in the thin daylight, I could see the sheen in his eyes. He looked older than he had the day before, not in the way gray hair makes you older, in the way truth does. "Lena," he said finally. He said my name like it hurt a little. "Yeah," I answered. His gaze dropped to his hands, fingers laced together so tight the knuckles had gone white. "You need to know the rest," he said. "About that night." "I know some," I said quietly. "From the stairs? From what people told us later." He shook his head. The motion was small but sharp. "You know, pieces. I've let you fill in the rest with whatever made sense." Anger stirred in me at that. The idea of him letting me believe he'd handed her over like a package. But there was something else under it now. The sound of her voice on that tape, saying fear makes us choose badly, saying she forgave him. The two feelings sat side by side, uneasy roommates. He cleared his throat. It came out hoarse. "After I gave him the envelope, you saw that much, right?" "I saw." Rain on the driveway, his shoulders hunched, the handoff under the yellow porch light. He came back in, calm. Too calm. Mark's eyes lowered, lashes a dark line. He put the envelope on the table like it was just mail, said, "You got something you want to tell me, Isabel?" I could picture it. The kitchen. The overhead light too bright. My mother at the sink, towel in her hand, shoulders tight. "She knew right away," he said. "I could see it. She didn't look at me, just at that envelope, and then at him. She asked where he got it. He said, 'Where do you think?' and smiled that way he did when he'd won before the game started." The candles sputtered softly, wax collapsing further. A draft nosed in from somewhere, carrying the faint scent of damp shingles and old insulation. She told him she was leaving, anyway. Told him she was talking to a lawyer. That she was done waiting for him to be someone else. She said she'd rather be poor and scared on her own than rich and scared in his house. He let out a breath that trembled at the edges. He lost it then. Not the worst I've seen him, but bad. Knocked the chair over, hit the wall, yelled about taking my kids and stealing my money. You know the words. I did. I had heard their echoes for years. "I stood there like an idiot," Mark said. "Between them. Not on anyone's side, just in the way. He told me to go to my room. I didn't. Mom told me to go upstairs. I still didn't." He gave a small broken laugh. "That was my big rebellion. Standing still." "What did he do?" I asked. He grabbed the keys. Hers. Off the hook by the door. Held them up like a prize. Said, "You're not going anywhere. Not with my car. Not with my kids." She walked right up to him and took them back out of his hand. He paused. He looked surprised. No one ever just took something back from him. Outside, a bird tested the morning with a short, uncertain call. The sound came in muted through the attic window, like it wasn't sure it belonged here yet. They yelled some more. Mark said, "Same fight, different words."
She told him the lawyer said she could get temporary custody, that a judge would see his temper. He told her no judge was going to take his family away. No piece of paper was going to tell him what to do in his own house. His voice had gone flatter, not empty, just constrained, as if he let one crack open, the rest would follow. Then what? I asked, though I knew the headlines of it. She told him she was leaving, he said simply. Right then. With or without his blessing. Said she'd go stay with Marie, come back with the sheriff if she had to. She picked up her bag, the envelope, the keys. She looked at me, just once, like she was taking attendance. I waited. He swallowed. She said, I'm still your mother, no matter whose story you believe. Then she walked out. He followed her to the door, shouting. I didn't follow. I just froze in the hallway. I heard the door slam, heard him slam his hand against it, heard her car start. He rubbed his thumb against his palm, a restless, groundless gesture. I saw flickers of my own memory then. The roar of the engine, the flash of red disappearing into a wall of water, the way the night had swallowed her whole. I didn't touch her car, Lena, he said abruptly. His eyes met mine, dark and raw. I swear to God, I never went near it. I never loosened anything. I wasn't trying to hurt her. I thought if he knew, I don't know what I thought. That he'd stop yelling, that he'd fix something, that it would scare her to staying. I didn't think. His voice broke there. I know, I said, and I was surprised to find that I mostly did. We sat with that for a while. The idea that the thing that killed her wasn't some hidden act of violence we could point to, but the ordinary, brutal physics of speed and wet roads and a woman driving too fast away from a house that had become unbearable. My anger didn't vanish. It shifted. I still felt fury at him, for telling, for choosing wrong, for handing our lives to our father like they were his to trade. I still felt something tight and sour when I thought of Daniel at that table, envelope under his palm. But there was something else under it now. The sound of her voice on that tape saying fear makes us choose badly. Saying she forgave him. The two feelings sat side by side, uneasy roommates. He cleared his throat. It came out hoarse. She still chose to drive, I said softly. It felt both cruel and true. He still chose to yell. You still chose him.
Everybody chose something. He nodded, eyes shut for a second, as if he were bracing for impact. And we all have to live with it, he said. One way or another. He opened his eyes again and looked at the letters, the tape player, the boxes. What do we do with all this? He asked. It wasn't rhetorical. It was a real question, small and scared. I thought of my father in that rehab room, wrapped in thin blankets and thicker denial, of the way his jaw had tightened at the word attic, of the way he'd said, we took care of it, like truth was a mess you could mop up and throw away. We make copies, I said. He frowned slightly. Copies? Of the letters, I said, of the documents, of the tape. My voice steadied as I spoke. One set for us, one for him. Mark let out a short, humorless huff. You think he's going to sit and listen to that? Maybe not, I said. But we can't keep pretending he doesn't know. If he chooses not to look at it, that's on him, not on us hiding it. He'd stared at me for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. I've got an old recorder at the garage. Cassette to cassette. It'll sound terrible. She'll still be her, I said. We climbed down from the attic, carrying the boxes like they were something alive. The house below looked different now that the lights had come back on. Smaller, brighter, less haunted and more empty. The next day blurred into errands. A trip to Mark's garage, the sharp smell of oil and rubber, the whirring click of an ancient tape-to-tape machine, copying my mother's voice from one cassette to another, her words wobbling slightly but holding. A stop at the library in town, their copier humming and spitting out black and white versions of the separation petition, the lawyer's letters, the list of hidden accounts, the if anything happens note. I slipped one set into a manila envelope and wrote, For Daniel, on the front in small block letters. Not Dad, not to be opened in case of, just his name, like a subject line. We didn't talk much while we did it. There was a shared understanding in the movement of our hands. This wasn't revenge, it wasn't absolution. It was simply putting the truth where it could no longer be edited out of the story. When we delivered it, the rehab room felt colder. He looked at the envelope, then at us, his mouth a hard line. He didn't open it in front of us. We didn't ask him to. "We thought you should have some paperwork," I said. "For the house, for the past." He took it with his good hand, fingers curling around the edge. For a second, the old force was back in his grip. Then it softened. On the last day, back at the river house, the rooms finally echoed. We'd emptied the closets, rolled up the rugs, taken our keep boxes to cars. The donation truck had come and gone, leaving blank spaces where furniture had once anchored the rooms. The walls looked taller without pictures. The air felt naked. In the kitchen, the only things left on the counter were a ring of old keys, the tape player, and the padlock from the attic, its breast dulled by all the hands that had held it. I touched it once, just to feel the weight, then left it there. Outside, the sky was a clear, ordinary blue. No storm, no drama. The river moved along behind the house, brown and steady, following its own paths as it always had. I stood on the front walk with my hand on the cold metal of the railing and looked up at the attic window. Sunlight poured through it now, bright and unapologetic, turning the glass into a solid square of white. From this angle, you couldn't see the beams or the blackened circle on the floor. You couldn't see the little panel with the hidden hinge. You couldn't see the dust we'd disturbed. But I knew what was up there, and what wasn't, anymore. Mark came out behind me, jangling the now mostly useless keys. "Realtor's coming at 2. I told her we'd leave the door open." "Okay," I said. He hesitated, then added, "You heading out now?" "Yeah, long drive." He nodded, then did something he hadn't done in years. He put his hand on my shoulder, squeezed once, and let it rest there for a breath longer than comfort required. "We did what we could," he said. "We did something," I replied. It was the closest I could get to agreement. We hugged, properly this time, not a quick, embarrassed bump of shoulders. His jacket smelled like rain and exhaust and a little like my father's old aftershave. He pulled back first, eyes red but clear. He smiled, not all the way, but more than before. Almost with his eyes. He said, "Call me when you get home." "I will." Driving away, the house shrank in the rearview mirror, then flattened, then vanished behind a curve in the road. The river stayed beside me for a while, then slipped away too, hidden by trees and distance. The car was quiet, no radio, just the soft rush of the tires on asphalt and the echo of my mother's voice in my head, talking about fear and choices and light. Breaking our silence hadn't fixed anything in the way stories sometimes pretend things get fixed. It hadn't brought her back, it hadn't turned any of us into heroes, but it had changed the shape of what we were carrying, from a tangle of secrets and half-remembered scenes into something we could at least name, even if we couldn't forgive all of it yet. As the town blurred into open road, I found myself wondering, not for the first time, what kind of life you can build when you finally let the past speak in its own unedited voice, and whether I was brave enough to find out.